Alliances, State and Private Sector Buy Clean Efforts. Please welcome our conversation moderator, Executive Director of Building Transparency, Stacy Smedley.
Hello, everyone. I'm very thrilled to be here to moderate the second panel, where we're going to dig in a little deeper into what's going on at the local, state, and private sector levels when it comes to embodied carbon policy. I want to thank Building Alliance and Thirdway again, just as everyone else has. I think one of the big impacts this is having on me is just meeting a lot of people in person that we've been engaged with over the course of the past 3 years. We did start all of this work pre-COVID. We existed through COVID and made a lot of progress, which I'm very proud of as a community. And now we're all here in person to really talk through this. So thank you for bringing us all together. So I'm going to go ahead and announce our panelists to the stage. You can just come up as I introduce you. First, Kareem Hammoud. Kareem's the Senior Policy Analyst with the U.S. Climate Alliance, where he leads their industrial decarbonization policy portfolio and manages the Alliance's state policy tracking initiatives. Next, we have Katie Ross. Oh, please, celebrate these people. They're all amazing. Next, we have Katie Ross, Sustainability Lead for Microsoft's Global Real Estate Portfolio. Katie's responsible for developing and implementing sustainability strategy across an office portfolio of more than 36 million square feet, enabling Microsoft's commitment to be a carbon negative, water positive, and zero waste company by 2030. So Katie, thanks for being here. And last but not least, we have Scott Schell, who is a fellow in the American Institute of Architects with over 2 decades of experience pioneering low-carbon architectural design. And now at ClimateWorks, Scott focuses on opportunities to reduce the carbon intensity of building materials across the globe, including concrete, cement, and steel. So thanks for being here, Scott. And with that, we're going to jump right in. There's a lot to say and not much time. So we're going to jump right into questions. I'm going to start with you, Scott. ClimateWorks has been a part of the Buy Clean work, I think, since the beginning. And I'd love if you talk a little bit about how you've engaged in supporting these policies to date, and really your perspective on how far we've come. I think Tricia said it well, but if you have any other comments you want to talk through just about where we were and where we are now in this process.
Yes, well, so I wasn't here in 2019 for this legendary meeting where so much of this work started. But the industry program at ClimateWorks has been here since the beginning and has been partnering with many of you and many of our other organizations to help convince everyone that industry is, in fact, a sector that we can tackle and that we are tackling. And so I just want to echo the other commenters this morning who said, congratulations, thanks all of you who have been doing this work. It's great to see such a big crowd here. And congratulations on the success in the last few years.
Great, thanks for that. So Kareem, the U.S. Climate Alliance has been instrumental, I think, in helping to build a federal state Buy Clean network, which Tricia mentioned also, to really share the knowledge and ensure that there's policy harmony from both the states as well as the federal Buy Clean policies that we're seeing. So how do you see this network that you're helping to build really help in advancing Buy Clean policies at the state level specifically?
Thanks. Before I go on, I also have to thank a lot of you in the room that I've met virtually in person over the past few years on this topic. You've all been instrumental in really helping me and my colleagues of the Climate Alliance help our states see the value and really the potential of Buy Clean policy. And, you know, everything you said, Stacy, really is sort of the goal, but I wouldn't say we're necessarily there yet at the Climate Alliance, but we do have plenty of groundwork that we've laid just in general to show the theory of change that states working together on substantially similar policies and the impacts they can have on, transforming markets, which I think is a big topic of today. So backing up, for anyone that doesn't know, the Climate Alliance is a bipartisan coalition of governors that was founded in 2017, grew from about 3 states up to 24 right now. And our membership is committed to specific targets, the 2030 and 2050 NDC targets to keep emissions from going above 1.5 degrees Celsius, while also centering justice, equity, and environmental justice, and a good, just economic transition in all of these policies as well. And we're not just a target-setting organization either. Governors commit to real action, and they've taken real action as well. So states have a lot of power within the energy and climate space. I think we all know that, but it's worth reminding everyone too. States are the principal actors in U.S. energy policy, and they're also the primary implementers of federal dollars as well. We have billions of federal dollars being mobilized that everyone has mentioned today, and states are going to be the key players in rolling that out effectively and in a climate-smart way. At the same time, states are also sort of the laboratories of innovation in the United States. I think one could argue that Buy Clean is one of those very policies that was pioneered at the state level and has now escalated and thankfully expanded to the national scale as well. But there's still many states that this is a very new area as well. And at the same time, this goes into like the complicating factors. We all know climate change is a super complicated topic, and states need support. They don't necessarily have all the information and technical expertise. And on a policy like Buy Clean, there's tons of learning that's yet to be done. And many states, despite the big or smallness of their bureaucracies, consistently cite staff capacity and resource constraints as key barriers to like policy implementation and adoption. And Buy Clean is no different. However, this is where the Alliance, my organization, comes in, as we play like a key role in helping drive policy outcomes across states by coupling the political will of governors, convening states together to share best practices, developing shared resources and tools, and collaborating with the federal administration, and then most importantly, providing a platform for governors to speak with one voice on topics such as Buy Clean to really push markets forward. The Alliance has also served as like a informative arm to prove that climate action at the state level doesn't have to come at the expense of economic costs. In fact, it's just the inverse. Alliance states have consistently proven year over year that even with strong climate policies, they're reducing emissions at a faster rate while also growing their economies at a faster rate than non-alliance states overall. They're also doing it while achieving lower levels of air pollution, delivering more energy savings to homes and businesses. They're employing 40% more workers in the clean energy economy, and I think that was my last stat. Excuse me. So that brings me to this Buy Clean coalition, or this partnership with the federal government. Alliance states have also represent a substantial amount of the U.S. economy, emissions, and population. Across our 24 states right now, states and territories, I should say, Puerto Rico and Guam are members. We represent 60% of the U.S. economy and over 55% of the population. So when these amount of states are unified on something, it really does have the power to transform markets. And this is something that's been demonstrated in the past with one of our favorite examples of this theory of change in another industry-related problem, which is the problem of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. If you're unaware, so the super polluting refrigerants that need to be phased out in line with the Montreal Protocol. So back in the Trump administration, states actually backstopped the EPA SNAP rule that had been, abandoned by the Trump administration, and through the Alliance, using the Alliance as a platform, we, supported them with developing shared tools and resources, a policy roadmap, and even a model rule that was eventually adapted and expanded to become the foundational HFC regulation at the state level in about a dozen states. States also worked together to speak to Congress and industry and essentially helped push forward what would eventually become the AIM Act, which was, one of the only expect to see this sort of policy momentum be brought to the table with something like Buy Clean. And so I can pause there and follow up with additional detail, but that's sort of the theory of change that the Alliance works under. And this partnership with the federal government, I think, presents a similar compelling opportunity to really drive down industrial emissions.
Great, thanks for that. So, Scott, I'm going to pick up on something that Kareem said, which is that states tend to be catalysts or laboratories for some of these things, and I think that there are examples of that when it comes to Buy Clean policy, at least in our experience with what we've done at BuildingTransparency. There's states that are kind of leading and testing. So could you give a couple of examples of some of the policies that we're seeing at the state level currently around Buy Clean?
Yeah, sure. These are some of the things that I'm most excited about, is this level of innovation that's happening at states and cities and private companies. One of them that I am really excited about is the New Jersey's LECLA policy. Like a lot of bike clean policies, they set a kind of benchmark or standard that all new concrete must meet for maximum emissions. And their innovation is they provide an incentive for going beyond that, for doing better than that. And so for every percentage that you get lower than their benchmark, they have a financial bid incentive for the amount of concrete, based on the amount of concrete that you deliver, that rewards this lower carbon. So it creates this virtual circle of more innovation, lower and lower carbon concrete, rather than just hitting the threshold and being done with it. Other cities are doing really interesting things. One of them is around whole building life cycle assessment. Most by clean things are just about the material emissions intensity. For whole building life cycle assessment, you multiply that material emissions intensity times the material quantities. So it also incentivizes you to do material efficiency. Almost all the industrial roadmaps include a material efficiency component of it. And in some ways, that is where this win-win-win comes in, because you're using less material, so you're not spending money on that material, so it's lower cost. And so we found in our architectural practice that by multiplying these different strategies together was where you got dramatically lower greenhouse gas savings and cost savings combined. And then one last one I wanted to mention that we're just starting work on right now. Many of you are familiar with California's zero emission vehicle mandate. Any car company that wanted to sell cars in California had to sell a certain percentage of zero emissions cars, generally electric vehicles. And if they couldn't sell those, they had to buy credits from somebody else that was making them. And Tesla had lots of extra credits because they only made electric cars. And they got lots of funding by selling these credits that enable their company to survive. So we're currently working on a policy for California. The state passed SB 596 that directs the California Air Resources Board to devise a strategy to get cement to net zero by 2045. And one idea we're proposing is a zero emission cement standard, where at least one of California's 8 cement plants will have to go to zero, transformational technology, carbon capture, and then can sell credits to other cement companies so that it's affordable for everybody. So just this level of policy innovation for us is really fun to watch.
That's great, and I think that just lends itself that even though we're focused around bike clean, there's additive policies and additive steps that we can take kind of around it to really push this forward, and states can play a key role in that. So we're going to move on to Katie and focus on the private side of the story for just a second. Katie, I think you're doing a lot of work at Microsoft around a lot of different things when it comes to reducing your climate impact, but specific to embodied carbon, you really are one of the leading companies that has tackled this, I think, even before some of the states were. So could you tell a little bit more about the requirements that you put in place on some of your projects, lessons you've learned from that, and some of the wins that you've seen from implementing bike clean-like policy in the private sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, as everyone else has said, to Blue Green Alliance and Thirdway for having me. So I think I get the unique opportunity of being the private sector voice in the room. So thank you for having me. So we, Microsoft, have been committed to sustainability for quite some time. We have an internal carbon fee. We have a significant commitment around renewable energy procurement. But in 2020, we sort of stepped back and said, are we doing enough? And the answer unequivocally was no. We are not doing enough. Society is not doing enough. What do we need to do to go forward? And that's really where we came up with our next-gen commitments of carbon negative, water positive, and zero waste. As part of carbon negative by 2030, it was a recognition that a majority of our carbon emissions was in scope 3, which is not unique to Microsoft. It is ubiquitous throughout society that most of it's in scope 3, but that really meant that we had to tackle, and part of carbon negative was to achieve a 55% reduction in our scope 3 emissions all by 2030. So we looked around within our real estate portfolio and said, well, we've got a lot of buildings that are being built. What is that going to mean in terms of our design strategies? At the time, we started actually back in 2019 a fairly substantial redevelopment project on our headquarters. It's 3 million square feet of new office space. And we knew that we wanted it to be operationally zero emissions. We are fortunate to have 100% renewable electricity fed from our supplier, and we made the decision for it to be an all-electric campus, which drove us to doing things like a thermal energy center with geothermal wells, and all-electric kitchens and dining operations and building operations, and sort of patted ourselves on the back and said, great job. And then we thought, well, now we're going to have to do all of the embodied carbon work. And that is significantly harder because at the time, there really wasn't, EC3 was a glimmer in Stacy's eye. And we hadn't had experience setting targets. So we set a target of 30% reduction in embodied carbon based on the CLF baseline using the EC3 tool. And it was the first time we had ever done it. I have been very heartened to hear about all of the collaboration between all the different agencies and the states and local government, because the same thing happened on the private sector side as well. I still remember the time we sat in a room with many of my counterparts at other big tech companies in real estate and said, we should all just work on this together for once. Let's just not create, a proprietary system. Let's partner together, use EC3, and have the same approach. And so it has been, I think that's a testament to where we are today, and how fast it's moving is because of this agreement that we will all work together. So back to campus modernization, we set the 30% reduction. One of my proudest moments on the project, I think, was when our development manager stood up and explained what embodied carbon was and said, this is what it means to buy better materials. And that really was a transformational moment across our project, because it really was not just, sustainability people saying, here's what we need to buy. It's every general contractor, every structural engineer, every subcontractor understanding when we give, when we're going through bids for materials, we want to see the carbon number and the dollar number, and we're going to make decisions based on both. And that was a pretty revolutionary thing for our project. Another just sort of, as I think about lessons learned, we used the 30% reduction at the beginning of the project during design, and then sort of coincidentally, we also decided to pursue the ILFI zero carbon certification, which has a 500 metric ton CO2 per meter square cap. And that was sort of introduced when we went into construction. And we found it has been far more successful and compelling to use a cap for our general contractors, because it's very similar to managing budgets or schedules. Can't exceed this number. They're going to put contingency. They're going to say, all right, I'm not super sure, but if we have it here, we'll probably hit the target. I love the New Jersey example of, how we incentivize better procurement. That's something that we're looking at on our jobs going forward as well. And a really good example of sort of a key win for us, but also a huge lessons learned, is we had a manufacturer that was delayed in schedule, and they offered at their cost to air freight us the materials so that it didn't impact our schedule. That meant we would exceed our carbon budget. And I don't know many people who make the decision to delay a construction schedule to allow for shipping a material when we were already behind schedule so that we wouldn't exceed our carbon cap. But I was very proud of the team and very proud to say that we did make that decision. And so I think that really identifies the power of setting, sort of using those mechanisms that already exist in the market today of budgets and managing schedules and things like that. But it also is a big lessons learned for us as we sat through and said, yeah, had we picked better materials at the beginning, we wouldn't put ourselves in this position of needing to push the schedule. So we're all learning as we go, and I think figuring out when we have to ask the right questions, what information needs to be in whose hand at the right time to optimize the decisions. But we've been particularly impressed and sort of proud to be part of this movement, and also seeing it now scale across all of our global operations, both on the real estate side and the data center side, really driving these decisions. And similarly to the administrator's comment, finding that it is not a massive cost add to hit those goals today. It's just about asking the right questions when we need to.
Great. Thank you, Katie. I think we all need to follow Microsoft as they continue this journey. There's other companies that are doing this on the private sector too, but I think there are lots of lessons learned. They're kind of the first implementers because of their ability to kind of push ahead on some of this. So I have a question for all of you. And Scott, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you. So we've now seen policies either proposed or implemented at the state level, some at the city level, in the private sector. Now we've got the federal Buy Clean policy initiatives happening. In your opinion, just Scott's opinion, what are the foundational requirements of embodied carbon policy that need to be consistent across all of those? If you had to make your own list.
I think, Stacy, it's a lot of what you're doing. It's a really good, transparent data infrastructure with a robust research underpinning on that. I think that's just fundamental. People have to be able to trust it, see the data, assess it for themselves. So
great. That's your.
So
I think that we're going to foundational standardized data. So that's great. I'm going to move on to Katie. Same question. What are the things that really must be aligned or consistent across Buy Clean-like policies?
I'll add one component to yours, which is a public methodology and open source. I think that was such a critical component for us for EC3 in using it. Is it wasn't a black box of data. We could pick it apart. We could understand. I made a comparison to the EPA Energy Star program for buildings. It's very similar in that we can sort of it's building that trust. Which then allows for those apple-to-apple comparisons. From my point of view, I will go down this rabbit hole a little bit. Methodology alignment has been really interesting for us as we've been thinking about public reporting and just how we quantify some of these things. It's not always aligned across all of the industries, and so I think yes, having transparent data and having an open database for that, but I think also something that allows sort of apples to apples comparisons and everybody being held to the same target, I think has really, we've seen in our project, been fairly transformational. And it means that we can all, the project is working together rather than in silos across different material sectors.
Great. Anything to add to that?
I mean, Scott and Katie covered, the data components, which are absolutely foundational to Buy Clean success. We also have to think about the other parts of what makes Buy Clean such an interesting policy concept is that it's not just it's not just a standard, right? It's also like a disclosure and transparency requirement that could be voluntary to start and then required later. There's that sequencing there that's interesting. And then there's also supporting incentives to help build that data infrastructure by, incentivizing industry, for example, to develop EPDs that are up to the standard, the consistent standard that Scott and Katie mentioned. And then there's also, the sequencing overall of how those things are set out and, which comes first. I think there's a lot of thoughts that folks in this room and, Blue-Green Alliance as well have on what the best sequencing is, and industry might have their own thoughts, but those are also I'm not sure if there's a best practice established just yet, but those are also other components besides the data piece.
Yeah.
I was just going to build on that. I think also one of the critical components is trying to build this within the existing processes that we do our project planning. There are going to be some changes that are necessary, but creating more and more tools that is a different tool each and every time that our general contractors have to use or different mechanisms just becomes that burden is really hard to embed within processes. So I completely agree with you. I think it's not only the infrastructure components, but it's also how do we make it as easy as possible to embed this within existing processes for procurement.
Okay, so I heard transparent, standardized data. I heard standardized requirements for things like product category rules. I heard proper sequencing in terms of how you roll out these things, transparency to limits or thresholds or reductions. I heard incentives. So that would be my list after what I just heard from all of you, and it would be the list that I would have said too. So I appreciate you just supporting my own thoughts on that. So next question, I think beyond, and Scott, you talked about this already, but I really want to kind of push on this a little bit. I think I have an opinion that buy clean is going to happen, where we see it all across everything. And so I tend to always look at what's next. Scott, you mentioned some of those triggers of what's next. I wonder if we can dig a little bit more into this idea of the LECLA policy and what they're doing around the incentivizing of this through funding, not only for just purchase of materials that meet a threshold, but actually rewarding the lower carbon materials. So I don't know if you want to just go a little farther on what's happening in that policy. I know that it's one that you're familiar with and excited about. And then Katie, maybe your thoughts on the private sector in terms of how they might build in some of that same kind of thinking into your bid process.
Yes, sure. I mean, and I think you're right that buy clean is the absolute foundation, but I do think there are some complementary policies that can go along with it. Most buy clean policies are by design very broad, and so use kind of industry standard technologies and production. But we do need to get to zero carbon materials, and those require different types of plants and production. And so one way to get buy clean to do that is to get a lot of people to make, instead of broad, shallow commitments, deep and narrow commitments. And so that might be, say, I'm going to require 10% of the products that I buy to be near zero carbon. And there are a number of examples like that of organizations that are trying to do that. The Industrial Decarbonization, IDDI, has a pledge, and level 4 is to buy 10% at near zero carbon. Concrete Zero and Steel Zero have similar programs where design professionals and contractors and others can make those commitments. The First Movers Coalition has a similar structure in many ways, and it's designed to solve that chicken and the egg problem, right? It's like, Microsoft has a building to build, and they have to be able to order the material. But you've got to build a plant first, and the manufacturer doesn't want to build that plant until they're sure there's going to be demand there. And so we can get a broad sector of folks and organizations to commit even to a narrow portion. That's the way to share the risk and share the cost, and yet give clarity to the producers that their demand will be there.
Great. Katie, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've certainly looked at using our internal carbon fee in showing the offset cost that will, the carbon removal that would be necessary in order to buy the higher carbon emissions material versus the lower one, and use some of those internal market mechanisms or internal processes that we have to make more compelling cases. It's that the carrot and the stick, making the carbon cap, having it be required, and then figuring out mechanisms to either provide a performance bonus or any sort of a benefit internally, or sort of use a triple bottom line approach to the calculations. I think the other one that comes to mind that's really exciting for me is some cities have been thinking about an embodied carbon building code, which makes sense if we have an EUI code in most of our cities, and increasingly as we move to 100% renewable electricity and a decarbonized electrified building sector. All of our building emissions are embodied carbon, and so if we're going to be building new ones, we probably should have an embodied carbon cap in the same way that we have an EUI target for buildings. And you could see that following very similar processes on, the green building codes or EUI codes, where there's an FAR bonus or some other incentive mechanisms that the building authority can provide to cities to sort of spur that investment. Because while it is great, there's private sector, and obviously now the largest procurement arm of the federal government is buying, including this in their procurement process. You really need to have everyone on board, and so that low embodied carbon and then the ultra low or whatever sort of mechanisms where everybody is engaged in that. And I think that the building code lever might be a really powerful one to start building that into sort of all developers' processes.
Great. And there are actually examples of building code proposals happening in some places like the city of Seattle and a couple others too, and ASHRAE. So Kareem, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm typically a pretty positive person, but I'm going to ask a negative question because I really think this is an important one. So we talk a lot about the positive things that are going on with agencies at the federal level working together and trying to have a common voice, and the states coming together. And then the private sector, Katie, you mentioned them coming together, you coming together, sitting around a table. And it's great to talk about all this stuff, but what's the risk if we don't actually come together and align what we're doing when it comes to these embodied carbon policies? What happens if everyone starts to go off and do their own thing? And I really want to talk about that risk, because I think it's important that we all have that in our brains to really push forward that sense of coming together. But I wonder if you could just give your thoughts on that kind of negative outcome if we don't actually try to align a lot of this work.
Sure, and I'll counterbalance it with a positive, like the state and local level on these policies that I don't think we've really honed in on.
Yeah.
So I think the risk of that harmonization not happening is you have industries all over the country, many of them with multi-state operations, suddenly having to, if they want to participate in bidding processes for public infrastructure projects, they have a bunch of different standards that aren't necessarily, that are slightly different, maybe similar enough, but different enough where they have to build out this administrative capacity to really understand what makes sense in one state versus another state versus a federal project. So that's not ideal at all. I think we could all agree. In terms of my positive spin is that, Buy Clean is still relatively new as a policy concept, but there's, it really lends itself well to this concept of leading by example, which I think was brought up numerous times today. And states and local governments have long been leading by example on other climate and energy policies for years. I mean, leading by example is really just state governments being accountable for the energy they use, the vehicles they purchase, and then now more recently in the Buy Clean space, the construction materials that go into their public assets. And so we're seeing this huge wave of momentum over the past few years targeting embodied carbon in municipalities, in states, in cities. And if anyone doesn't believe me, Carbon Leadership Forum has a fantastic map that tracks all of these policies globally, actually, and just zoom in on North America and you'll be impressed by how much is happening. But, by my count, as a state-focused guy, we have 4 states with Buy Clean or embodied carbon legislation that is now law. We have 7 more with bills in session currently that may or may not pass, hopefully a lot more getting passed. We have 3 states that have issued executive orders targeting embodied carbon in state buildings. We have 3 states that are conducting studies or have conducted studies or pilot projects in advance of adopting a statewide policy. And then, of course, we have several other states that have proposed moving these policies forward in recent climate and clean energy plans at the state level. And then, of course, we have the dozen states that have committed to working in partnership with the federal government on Buy Clean moving forward. So that's a lot of that's a lot of activity that I think really shows we're at a very interesting moment and a great opportunity to really harmonize all this work with an amazing influx of money coming from the federal level, coupled with state and political interest at local and the private level as well. So I'll stop there.
That's great. And I love that you took the negative and turned it into a positive, because that's typically my role. And it's like playing a little devil advocate there, so I appreciate you doing that. Scott, I'm going to give you the chance just to maybe end with a positive statement that you'd like to get out there if you haven't said something that you'd want to, or something that you want to leave this audience with today. And then Katie, I have something for you that I really want to end with, so I'll go to Scott.
Yeah, I'll pick up on Kareem's discussion a little bit about the innovation that can happen at different levels, whether it's state, local, or private sector. Before I joined ClimateWorks, I was working a lot on building electrification policies. And this little liberal town called Berkeley, California, had this idea, one city councilwoman had this idea that we're going to make an ordinance that all new construction should be all electric and no fossil fuels. And it was kind of radical at the time, but it's Berkeley, right? Berkeley is radical. And so I worked very closely with them for about a year. And all this background work was done. We found hundreds of projects in California and the Bay Area that were all electric, and we put them on a slideshow. We did policy work, we did cost work, we did all this other stuff. And sure enough, they passed it. And everybody was really pleased. Oh, we now have this one little town that's all electric. Well, pretty soon, the town next door passed it. And then the two towns over passed it. And today, 3 years later, over 108 cities across the United States have passed it. And so, for me, it was an example of how a local innovation, if it's a good idea and the homework has been done, it can spread very quickly. There are a lot of people out there looking for ideas that work. And if you can show them one, they will adopt it. And so I just encourage you, if you have ideas, get on with it, recruit some people, and let's make it happen. So.
Great, thank you. And so, Katie, I think for you, being one of the first to actually see a project through with some of this kind of embodied carbon policy, and also being a proud Washingtonian, could you just tell the story of what we've seen happen in the concrete sector thanks to Microsoft's work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started, full transparency, when we started, we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into. We knew it was important. We knew it was going to be critical for us to give it a shot, but we were very much hoping that we would meet the 20%. We had all of the CLF and building transparency sort of information that said this is possible, but there was certainly a number of people who were in the development team who were like, I'm not so sure about this. So it was incredible because as we started talking with the local concrete companies, the local steel companies, there was far more information than we realized. They were all, we were building a fairly big project, and some people know who we are. And so there was obviously interest in, being on the Microsoft project. But the level of work that was already done, I think, was really impressive. That was something that was really heartening to see. And what we've seen since then is, as a result of our project, there were no precast concrete EPDs, and our garage was a precast concrete garage. And we talked to the manufacturer and said, we'd really like you to create an EPD. And they said, great, yep. And so now there's precast concrete EPDs. We've seen in Washington, since we started, a 20% reduction in concrete emissions in Washington state, and that is, I'm not going to say it's entirely exclusively based on the Microsoft commitments and our project, but I think that in starting that engagement and having those conversations with the concrete manufacturers, it was, I think, really incredible just to see the number of people who said, yeah, we're already doing this. This is part of here. If you just were to pick the better material, we have it already. And so it's just really driving that competition, and it's possible today. And I think that was the most inspiring part so far, is the number of people who, manufacturers specifically, who have been in this for quite some time, seeing the benefits of reduced carbon emission, reduced virgin material usage, better, more efficient processes from a cost and a better product perspective. And they're just very heartened by the fact that, us people who have been buying things are finally placing importance on those components and including that in our decision making.
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll end right there. The power of asking, I think, is really important. So thanks to all three of you for joining us in this conversation today, and thanks everyone for being here and for having this event.